Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Maartje.
And we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're talking about the movie South Pacific, which came out in 1958. It was directed by Joshua Logan and written by Paul Osborne. It was adapted from the 1949 musical of the same name by Rodgers and Hammerstein, which was in turn based on Tales of the South Pacific by James A. Michener, a collection of short stories. Published in 1947, it was the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction the following year. The movie was nominated for 3 Academy Awards and won 1 for sound. Michener himself served with the U.S. Navy in the Pacific during World War II, and the stories are loosely based on his travels as a naval historian. The book features an ensemble of characters adjusting in different ways to having been plucked from their familiar American lives to fight a war in the strange and exotic South Pacific. Their adventures and misadventures, which occasionally overlap, are structured into 19 stories around the through line of planning and carrying out a fictional attack on Japanese-held islands called Operation Alligator. Michener began working on the book while he was still overseas after narrowly surviving a plane crash. 2 stories in particular, Fodala and Our Heroine, were adapted into South Pacific. What did you think of this movie?
Well, it's a musical, and I'm just not sure if World War II makes for a good musical background. It's just strange. There were some cool camera effects in it, and the colors on the screen they were really interesting, and they had the well-known glamour shots in this, again, where people look super pretty, so I like that. I didn't particularly like any of the songs, except there's one song that we'll get to that I thought was strangely refreshing for the time that it was made in, but I didn't think they were very catchy overall, so yeah, I don't know. Meh. How about you?
Well, Rodgers and Hammerstein, obviously absolute titans of the musical stage. I mean, Sound of Music, Oklahoma. And so I was sort of peripherally familiar with South Pacific. A lot of the songs have become standards in the intervening years, super famous if you're into musical theater at all. But I had never seen it before, and I wasn't really familiar with what it was about. And you're right, it's a little bit odd to watch a musical, almost comedy about the war in the Pacific. And I did read the book, of course. And though it's fiction, it is based around Michener's experiences on anecdotes that he heard from other sailors and that type of thing. The book is a little bit more serious in tone than the movie is. There's a whole back chunk of the book that follows Operation Alligator and all these guys as they go into combat, and everyone pretty much dies at the end, which is not really how the musical ends. So yeah, it was quite a bit different. The musical is very, very loosely based on the source material, but it's kind of fun. There's a reason why it's a classic, I think. I don't know if it was my favorite movie I've ever seen or musical I've ever seen, but this one came recommended to us by some other World War II nerds that we know. So, you know, I'm glad that we watched it. It was definitely a change from our usual stuff.
Yeah, and to add, for something that came out in 1958, it's fairly progressive in some ways, as in there's some representation that we don't even see, I think, nowadays very often. Well, we're slowly getting there, but there's a black person in this, and there's some other people of color in this that, you know, I thought were, for the time, at least, pretty daring and brave, and maybe not the most popular thing to do if you're a musical writer or a movie maker in that time, so it surprised me for sure.
Yeah, it felt a little ham-fisted to me, and I think if you watch it now, you're not necessarily going to be like, wow, what a beacon of progressivism. But for the time, definitely. It depicted an interracial relationship. There's different little elements in the plot that we'll talk about later. But yeah, and I mean, it was controversial, right? When this musical came out, there were places where it would be touring and they wouldn't get booked in the Deep South, or they would go to play at a theater that was segregated and they would insist on it being integrated before they would perform the show and that kind of stuff.
And there's another fun fact that you mentioned to me offline, which I had also forgotten. This is a musical that Robert Leckie, that we know from the Pacific, the TV show The Pacific, walked out of because he thought this is not what the Pacific was like, the war in the Pacific. And that's what I think prompted him to write his memoir, Helmet for My Pillow. Another interesting little fact for you.
Yeah. We've touched on this before when we've talked about other movies like Life is Beautiful, but it's like, what are we allowed or not allowed to make into a comedy? You know? I don't know. I think there's pros and cons.
Yeah, and there's obviously the Pacific in this is portrayed as this paradise, and people are very happy to be there, obviously, because it's beautiful, and that's kind of the Pacific in this is almost a character on its own, but it's a very positive one, and I feel like someone like Robert Leckie might have seen it and thought, well, that's not how I experienced it, which, makes sense. Yeah, again, interesting thing to make a musical about, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's get into the movie musical thing. It starts with Act 1, and we see some beautiful shots of the South Pacific in 1943, and the book takes place in and around the Solomon Islands, east of Australia and Papua New Guinea, and the Cook Islands, northeast of New Zealand. So if you're looking at the map, that's where you'll find the Solomon Islands. Missioner himself served in the nearby New Hebrides Islands, and they are now called Vanuatu, I think.
Vanuatu.
Vanuatu, thank you. We meet Lieutenant Joseph Cable, played by John Kerr, and he's being taken in a bit of a rickety plane called the Bouncing Belt to an island where he will begin reconnaissance work on where to take a position to spot and relay information about incoming Japanese forces.
Yeah, this is our sort of through plotline of the movie. They want to basically post the guy on an island, potentially one that's been occupied by the Japanese, and then he's going to Morse code back the troop movements and ship movements of the Japanese and try not to get caught. And so this is the base reason why Cable has come to this island, but then a bunch of other shenanigans unfold from here.
Basically, what this is portraying is the beginning, I think, of island hopping, which is obviously what the Americans were doing in the Pacific. They were just taking islands and fighting on islands, but they were changing quite a bit during the campaign. I didn't know too much about this very first bit of the war, to be honest, in the Pacific. It was quite nice to read about it.
On the island, Luther Billis, played by Ray Walston, an irascible CB, and a CB is a Navy construction battalion sailor. Him and his friends are bored. They're all hanging around on this island. They seem to be soaking up the sun. They don't have a ton of work to do. They're dying to visit this nearby island called WWII, and they can kind of see it in the distance, and it's all surrounded by mist, and it's very mysterious. But you're not allowed to sign out a boat unless you're an officer. And they don't have an officer who's willing to indulge in their shenanigans. And I looked into this. WWII is based on a real island called Ambae, which is home to Vanuatu's largest active volcano. It's kind of neat if you go and look at it from above on Google Earth. You just see this huge volcanic crater in the middle. And it was visible from a major American airbase on a neighboring island called Espiritu Santo.
What a cool name for an island, that second one.
Yeah.
I looked up some stuff about the CBs that I will tell you all at the end of this episode. We also meet Bloody Mary, played by Juanita Hall, who appeared in a Broadway show as well and became kind of synonym, I feel, to this character. She's a Tonkinese woman who runs the island's trade in souvenirs for Americans who are obviously on the island. And with immediate plans for Cable, so you can see her she checks him out and she's like, "You sexy man." And then, she wants to have something to do with him for some reason. And she wants to get him over to WWII.
Yeah, this plotline is taken from the book. So I gather when Mitch Turner was in the South Pacific, the French owned a lot of these little islands. And what they would do is they would bring workers over from Tonkin, or what is today North Vietnam. So they would bring all these workers over from Tonkin as basically indentured servants. They would work there for years at a time. And in this particular plotline, what's happening is that all the plantation workers have figured out that they can make grass skirts. And by selling them to these American sailors and Marines and Seabees who are over here, they can actually make more money doing that than they can on the plantation. And of course, all the French plantation owners hate this because none of these indentured servants want to do any dang work anymore. So they're constantly on the ass of the Americans to stop buying these grass skirts, tell them they can't sell them to your soldiers. And, it's a bit of a losing battle. But the north part of Vietnam eventually, of course, became a center of power for the communist Viet Minh. And the real Bloody Mary, or the person that Bloody Mary was based on, once told Michener that after the war, she planned to return to French Indochina to fight the colonialists. And he actually later said, I would often think of her when American troops were fighting their fruitless battles in Vietnam, and I wondered if our leaders realized that the enemy they were fighting consisted of millions of determined people like Bloody Mary.
Don't the Americans do the thing America does and say, look, we can make these grass skirts better than you can?
Yeah, it's definitely a thing in the movie. Billis, who is kind of our comic relief character, he has a big old crush on a U.S. Navy nurse named Nellie Forbush, played by Mitzi Gaynor. She's the female lead, but she's falling in love with a local French plantation owner, the very dashing Emile Debec, played by Rosanna Brazzi.
I like Debec. Debec is fun. I wasn't really into the romance in this movie. I'm usually all for romance, but I wasn't really into it. Maybe because it's a musical. Maybe I just don't like this particular musical that much. But he's definitely charming.
Yeah, their whole thing is that he's much older than her and they're in hugely different social classes. So she's like a farm girl from Little Rock, Arkansas, and he's a wealthy plantation owner from the South Pacific. So they're from two different worlds.
Yeah. I say I don't like any of the songs. That's not really true. I do like the songs, but I feel like for me, if I watch a musical, if I don't know the songs yet, I have trouble finding them entertaining. So probably if I watch it a few more times, I might like them better, but I don't know if I will. I feel very unsure about this whole musical.
I also find with musicals, I almost always like seeing them better performed live.
Yeah.
No, there's so many movie adaptations of musicals that I just don't like. If I had the chance to see this live, I'd probably check it out.
Can I tell you a secret? I watched this musical at 1.5 times the speed because I thought everything was so slow. And it gets better if you do that, to be honest. I did like the song about the guys missing their ladies back home. It was a fun song.
It was cute, yeah.
Captain George Brackett, played by Russ Brown, and Commander Bill Harbison, played by Floyd Simmons, are trying to find out more about the Beck because they need someone to go on a mission with Gable, who knows the islands well. The Beck has been here for a while and he knows some people on the island, they think. So they asked Nellie to inquire about his background and his politics because obviously they want him to be on their side. But she's not very keen, but then she's also unsure because she doesn't really know him that well. And she's considering breaking up with him over their age and class difference. But she can't really seem to make that stick. Like, she really does like him.
Yeah, there's a fun song, maybe my favorite song from the musical, called I'm Gonna Push That Man Right Out of My Hair. And it's in the original musical when they were doing rehearsals, this song wasn't in it yet. And then the original actress who played Nellie on Broadway, Mary Martin, came up with the idea for doing a song in the shower while she was in the shower during rehearsals. And so Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote that song because of that.
I wonder if she was trying to wash a man out of her hair in the shower.
Yeah. Imagine washing your hair on stage every night for as long as this show ran.
Wow. Yeah. The sets, I have to say, are really fun. I wonder where they filmed this. It looks like a real beach.
Yeah, one of the Hawaiian Islands.
Yeah, that makes sense then. It looks really fun.
Also, Commander Bill Harbison, who has a tiny role in this, is sort of a major character in the book. He reappears frequently in various stories, and he's actually kind of a dick. He originally dates Nellie, actually, and almost tries to sexually assault her in a car. And then she ends up being like, no, I don't like that guy. And that's how she ends up with Debec. And then Harbison, towards the end of the book, when they're all getting ready to go on Operation Alligator, he comes up with an excuse why he has to go back to the States so that he doesn't have to fight. And he ends up being just like a big weenie. So I feel like they briefly dropped him into this movie. They assigned his name to a character, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the book character.
No, I feel like both of these higher-ups, they don't really have that much character to begin with.
No. I did read that apparently Harbison originally in the musical was supposed to be a competing love interest for Nellie, but they just decided there was already too much going on.
I mean, there's quite a couple of different storylines within the musical, so yeah, that makes sense.
They approached Debec. We actually find out that the reason why he left France in the first place was because he killed a man. And Nellie is a little bit upset about this, but he's like, don't worry, he deserved it. And then she's like, okay, well, fair enough.
It takes her 2 seconds, too. So I don't think she even leaves him and then is okay with it. She just stays with him and is okay with him after like 2 seconds.
Yeah. So he left France because he killed a man. They find out that he doesn't support Pétain. He's a de Gaulleist, so he is on the side of the Allies, really. So they're like, all right, we can ask him to go on this spy mission with Cable. But he's like, I don't want to because I'm falling in love with Nellie. I want to hang out here with her and just be a rich plantation owner and hang out with my girlfriend.
And we also, I think, know by now that he has children because he has 2 children from a previous relationship with someone from the island. And they have a cute little song. I did really like that song.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the book, he has, I think, 8 or 9 kids with 3 or 4 different women. And they sort of sanitized it for the movie and musical because they make him a widower who has 2 kids by the same woman rather than just some man whore who gets around.
I mean, he's also a murderer, so why add a couple women to that? And a couple children from different people, sure.
Yeah, and they also made a choice in the original book, I believe, the children that Nellie meets, because we'll get to that in a minute, are Black. And the children that she meets in the musical and in the movie are Polynesian. So they're more acceptably mixed race for 1950s America than having a half Black kid is having a half Asian kid, I guess.
Interesting. But those little details about production like that are so interesting. So eventually, Billis convinces Cable to go with him to Belly High. There, they encounter Bloody Mary. She's like right there when they get to the island. And her daughter, called Liat, played by France Nugent. And Cable and Liat have a little romance, spend the night together, but we learn that it's all part of Bloody Mary's plan to get them married. She's like, you have to marry my daughter.
Yeah. The book is so much weirder about this. They go into Bloody Mary's house and Cable doesn't know why she's bringing him to her house because she doesn't really explain it. And then he comes in the house and there's this 17-year-old girl just standing there. And Bloody Mary's like, okay, I'm going to leave you alone. Have fun. And then she just leaves. And you're like, strange vibes. She's like whoring her daughter out to this man. It's just really weird.
It's a bit like that in a musical too, but not as obviously, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know how to feel about this relationship because it did seem quite sweet. But at the same time, he's a child. And he even calls her that. He calls her the little girl or something, or someone does at least.
Yeah. It's a little bit squicky. I'm not super into it, but we'll just, in our minds, we'll pretend that she's an adult who is of age.
Excellent. That sounds good.
Back at Nellie's plotline, she attends a party at DeBeck's and stays the night. He invites her to a party and she's like, nah, I don't really know if I should come to this party. And he's like, I come to the party. So she comes. And then the same thing happens where she's like, I don't think I should stay the night. And he's like, you should stay the night. And she's like, okay. But then things take a turn because she meets his 2 children and she's a white lady from small town America in the 1950s. So she immediately can't reconcile her racism about him having previously lived with a Polynesian woman and having 2 half Polynesian children. So she's like, I can't do this. And she leaves.
The 1940s even. The 50s, but 40s, it's even worse probably. Yeah, I don't know. This musical does a thing where it tries to be honest, but then gets over that so quickly that I'm like, do you really mean it? The racism too. He gets upset, and then she's like, oh wait, I'm done being upset now.
Yeah, I think it's part of her character arc. We're supposed to like her and find her an amiable person, and then we find out that has these racist beliefs, and then in Act 2, as we'll see, she kind of realizes that she's wrong and she kind of gets over it. That whole thing is supposed to be her character arc, and we're supposed to identify with her as the audience and being like, oh, this is a really nice person, but she still holds these racist beliefs, but she was able to grow and change. So I get that about her, but I do find that Act 2 is not as strong as Act 1 in terms of really hitting those beats, I guess.
I do also wonder if it's emphasized by the fact that it's a musical. Like musicals, things are so, I don't know if conflated is the word that I'm looking for, but obviously you don't have a whole lot of story in between songs to give emotions a lot of time and give thoughts time to sit. Like it moves fairly quickly.
Yeah, although I do think that, Rodgers and Hammerstein were some of the first people to write musicals where the songs actually drove the plot forward, because it used to be when they made musicals, it would be like plot, 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 and then people sing, but then nothing happens like during the song. And I do find that the songs do kind of teach you about the characters and move the plot forward.
Yeah. Also, there's a load of old-timey kissing in this again. I have to mention it to get it out of my system.
Yeah, the old face sucking.
It's so dramatic. Anyway, it's time for Act 2 now.
Wait, you gotta tell everyone about the intermission.
What is the intermission? It's just a 5-minute black screen with just music.
It just says intermission and there's music, and then between Act 1 and Act 2.
Yeah, I do like intermissions like that, to be honest, because it gave me time to go and get a drink.
Yeah, I guess back in the era where you couldn't pause a movie, you know?
I'm trying to remember if there was an intermission in Sound of Music or if there was only like a prelude. I think there was only a prelude at the very beginning.
I don't remember.
But I do think it's nice, like it's a moment of you get to reflect on what's happened in Act 1. So it's quite nice.
It's true, and it clearly sets out the story as like a construct for you. Like, all right, we're about to hit the peak of the action and that kind of stuff. It clarifies where you are in the story.
Yeah, so good point. First we get an intermission. It lasts, I want to say, a good minute and a half or 2 minutes. Otherwise, it's quite long. And then we get to Act 2, where Nellie is very upset over her breakup with the Beck. So upset even that she has requested a transfer to another island. The show must go on, though, which I think is a perfect note for a musical. She appears in a Thanksgiving Follies performance with Billis. So this is a morale show for the troops that are on the island.
Yeah, she's fun. The female lead is fun in the song that she performs in this. It's a little treat. I enjoyed it.
And then you get Billis looking like, I don't want to say he looks like a woman because he doesn't, but he's wearing like a grass skirt and not much else.
He's just wearing an absolute travesty of a lady costume.
And it looks like they got a whole lot of people out to watch this show, like, as they were filming.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's shit else to do.
And Lebec comes to watch, I think, to apologize or to come back with her, and then he sees her with Billis on the stage and he walks away.
Yeah, he brings flowers. It's the whole thing. Cable has been visiting with Liat, and when I say visiting, I mean they've been smashing. Bloody Mary warns that Liat is going to be married off to a rich plantation owner if Cable won't marry her. So she's kind of holding this over his head, like, listen, you better put a ring on it or I'm going to find some guy who will. But Cable can't envision a life with Liat because he's also racist. Because he's thinking, they go into this a bit more in the book. He's like, what, am I going to bring her back to Philadelphia or wherever he's from? And this woman from the jungle and, my family won't accept her and it'll be a whole thing. He can't bring himself to commit. And so Mary drags Liat away. And there's like a really long scene where it goes back and forth between Cable looking forlornly into the jungle and Liat's reaching for him, but she's being dragged away. And then it just keeps cutting back and forth between them.
It's kind of sad. I know he's racist, but he seems legitimately upset about the fact that he's racist.
Yeah, crucial, I guess, because he is, spoilers, I guess, he is going to grow as a person, and that's the important part.
The Beck tries to win Nellie back, but she tells him that she can't get past her prejudices. Spoiler alert, she can. Cable decides he'll stay on the island after all and marry Liat. So yay! The Beck, upset by what has transpired, agrees to go on a mission with Cable after all. He's like, well, if I can't get my woman, then I guess I'll go on a suicide mission.
Yeah, this is where there's a song called You've Got to Be Carefully Taught, which is about institutional racism and about how people aren't born racist. They learn to be racist from the people in their lives. And it was super controversial at the time. As well, of course, as the musical's depiction of interracial relationships. Interracial marriage was still illegal in some southern states until 1967. There were American legislators who were talking about how this was communist ideology. This musical was trying to make everyone a communist by promoting interracial relationships. It was really a strange time.
Yeah, I do like this song. Like, I think for the time, it's pretty brave to write a song like this that's just very self-aware. I think more people should hear it today and try and see that you should not teach your children to be racist.
Yeah, when they were first doing rehearsals for the musical, I gather someone told Rodgers and Hammerstein, like, oh, that song, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught, like, you should maybe consider taking that out. And they were like, actually, that's the whole point. I do think the song is maybe not the best written song. I think it's a bit clunky, but the message is there. So there is that.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely also not the most fun song, but it's not supposed to be honest.
Listen, were we ever going to get a jaunty little tune about
racism? No.
Yeah. So Billis inadvertently provides a diversion for Cable and Debec to land on the island. So they're going to this other island. They're going to be watching what the Japanese are doing. Billis falls out of the plane on the way there, and he's like in the water, and him being in the water distracts the Japanese. So they're able to get over to the island. It's kind of a funny little bit. So Cable and Debec are on this island. They're providing lots of intel over the radio as to the Japanese ship movements and aircraft movements and all that kind of stuff. Knowing that the Japanese were going to invade many of the Pacific Islands in 1942, the Australians actually trained a bunch of Pacific Islander civilians, reinforced by Australian commandos, to operate behind enemy lines as radio operators. So they would hide out in the jungle somewhere. They would provide crucial tactical information about Japanese troop movements, and often they could provide early warning of Japanese bomb runs. This was really crucial on places like Guadalcanal, where the Americans ended up in situations where they couldn't necessarily get out of the way, but it was helpful to have advance notice. And JFK was actually saved by a group of Islander scouts under this program off the Solomon Islands when he was shot down by a Japanese destroyer in 1943. And there is a story in the book about one such figure called the Remittance Man. They never name him, I don't believe, who was killed by the Japanese. And he's actually based on a real person named Major Martin Clemens, who was the coast watcher that first alerted the Allies that the Japanese were planning to build an airstrip on Guadalcanal. And after that, of course, as we know, the Allies landed on Guadalcanal and, tried to prevent that from happening. And so Clemens actually survived the war, but he did live an extremely dangerous life in the jungle for some time. He was hunted from place to place by the Japanese. And of about 400 coast watchers, more than 30 of them were captured, tortured, and killed.
Wow. Something happens next that made me sad, because Cable is killed when their position is strafed by Japanese fighter planes. And you don't see him get killed exactly. But Beck radios in and tells the other guys that they are burying him, and you don't see him die. But it's sad. Like, I didn't want Cable to die.
He just got over his racism.
It's sad. Anyway, they are successful in getting some information through, but then they are stuck on the island. So Nellie doesn't know what's happened to the Beck he's missing. And it kind of makes her rethink her ideas about being with him. At the same time, she knows that Cable is dead, because they all know that Cable is dead. And she has to go and tell Liat, which is kind of sad, because Liat really did like Cable.
Yeah. Yeah, for a comedy, someone does die at the end, but I guess it is a war.
I guess it's not all of them, though, so I guess that's good.
Yeah. The Marines begin to land on many nearby islands in a major pushback against the Japanese called Operation Alligator. This is obviously fictional, but it is based on the book. And so this includes everybody. Our buddy Billis is there. Everyone's involved in this huge invasion. And all this has been facilitated by Cable and Debec's heroic actions, their ability to pass information back and tell everyone what the Japanese were up to. And Operation Alligator is where many of the previous storylines come together in the penultimate chapter of the book. And the character of Cable, who does not reunite with Liat or express an interest in that, dies in a beach landing.
In like a final-ish scene, Nellie is staying at the Beck's place because she's changed her mind and she's looking after the kids and singing their little song with them. And that's when the Beck returns miraculously, and they are very happy together and live happily ever after. The end.
Yeah. They decided when they made this musical to make the major themes about overcoming racism, which is great. Like, I'm glad that they did that. But it's just interesting to me because it's not really a main theme of the book. I mean, there are people of color in the book, more characters than there are in the movie. The book is really more about people who are ripped out of their everyday lives and they're having to make the best of it in the Pacific. And some people do a better job than others.
There's also some scenes in the musical and in the movie were so strange, like the sacrificing of is it a pig? But it's such a, so wild.
Yeah, the book and the movie are both kind of racist about Indigenous people. They're constantly waving around these shrunken heads. South Pacific Islanders didn't do the shrunken head thing. That was a South American thing. Every racist stereotype you can think of about Native people, they're like, yeah, these Native people do that. They like to sacrifice pigs. They do this, they do that. It's like, okay.
So the runtime of this musical is about 2 hours and 14 minutes or something. It's quite long. But then, like all old-timey stuff, it's also quite slow in the way it's acted and spoken and all that. If, like me, you want to get home quickly, just watch it at 1.5 times the speed. You can still understand what they're saying. They talk at a normal pace at that speed. That's fine.
As a musical, I don't think it's going to make you a lover of musicals if you weren't one already, but there are some fun songs in it. I think I'd like it better performed live than the movie. Like, they definitely made some choices in the movie. Like, there's these weird, colorful filters over everything the whole time, and apparently the director didn't really like them. He wanted them to take the colored filters out, but they had pre-sold a bunch of tickets to the movie and they didn't have time to make the changes. And it's so weird, y'all. It's like a bright...
I quite like that, to be honest. I thought that was one of the more interesting things about the way the movie was made.
I thought it was awful. Like, it was so distracting.
To me, it kind of reinforced the magic of the South Pacific as it's portrayed. It's supposed to be this paradise in this show. And I thought it really contributed to, maybe not the yellow one, because the yellow one just makes everyone look awful. But they do like purple ones and blue ones and all that sort of stuff. And I actually quite liked it.
It was too much. Maybe if they dialed it back a little bit and it had been more subtle, but it was a lot.
I agree to disagree. Right. We had some notes. Sam wants to read a bit from the book.
They will live a long time, these men of the South Pacific. They had an American quality. They, like their victories, will be remembered as long as our generation lives. After that, like the men of the Confederacy, they will become strangers. Longer and longer shadows will obscure them until their Guadalcanal sounds distant on the ear, like Shiloh and Valley Forge.
I do like that quite a lot. I like the longer shadows bit. Such an interesting way to describe memory of people.
Especially because he wrote this a couple of years after the war when it was still fresh in his mind. And for us reading it now, I mean, their generation has largely passed away, and the names of these battles do feel far away to us.
I feel like the Pacific, specifically, like the Pacific theater is so much further away from us, you and I, the Westerners. The European theater is much more in our memory than the Pacific is, even though we've seen a lot now.
I also think that's partly because no Canadians fought in the Pacific, really, and obviously the Dutch theater of war either. I think if we were Americans, it's probably different.
Probably. But maybe it's also the nature of that specific theater is so strange, because it was largely fought over islands that had nothing to do with the actual war itself. There were people already living there that just got mixed up in this conflict that they had nothing to do with. Just a strange kind of warfare.
For sure. And definitely fighting over these hunks of coral or volcanic rocks that realistically wouldn't have much practical use to anyone.
Yeah, and I feel like many of those, or at least some of those, later on people said this was utterly pointless to fight this particular battle on this particular island.
The show ran for 1,925 performances on Broadway, which at the time was the second longest running musical in Broadway history after Oklahoma, which was also by Rodgers and Hammerstein. The cast album spent 69 weeks at #1 on the Billboard, and its success allowed Michener to quit his job and become a prolific novel writer. He wrote quite a few novels that, if you're a big reader of the late 20th century American novels, you've probably read something by Michener.
Did you like his writing style? Would you read more?
I don't think if it were written today that it would win the Pulitzer Prize. I think that in that era, they gave out a lot of prizes for books that they felt captured the American experience or like a unique perspective and that kind of stuff, which is not to say that it was poorly written or anything, but ultimately it is a collection of fun short stories. You know, it's not necessarily a world-changing work of fiction. But yeah, I did enjoy it. I thought it was a good read. I did think that the 1940s brand of casual racism toward Indigenous people sort of wore on me as the book went on. But I always like reading books like that by people who were actually there, and you really get a sense for how they experienced it and how they saw it. And it seems to be a little bit different for everyone.
It's at least a little better, I take it, than the Bridge and the River Kwai.
Definitely. Yeah, much better.
So I did a tiny bit of rabbit holing for this episode because what the fuck are CVs? So I had to look up the CVs. The CVs, to remind you, the letters C and B stand for Construction Battalion. So that's why the name CVs. They were part of the Navy and they were engineers and construction workers, but they were specifically trained for combat. The first CB units were authorized on the 5th of January of 1942, and the official name, the CVs, were authorized on March 5th of that year, so 3 months later. And when they just started recruiting, they recruited experienced civilian construction workers and gave them military training. They had a motto, and their motto was, "We build, we fight," because they did both. Famously, they were under attack while they were building stuff like airstrips and bases and huts and all that sort of stuff. They had to defend their construction sites. They were responsible for constructing essential military infrastructure, like I said, like bases and airstrips and runways under combat conditions. So basically, they were sent in first, or at least quickly at the start of a military operation, to build stuff like runways. And they were active on islands like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. And I think there's an airfield called Henderson Airfield, if I remember correctly, that they were absolutely paramount in getting that airstrip rebuilt for the Americans instead of the Japanese.
Well, and especially because what would happen is the Japanese would come by and bomb the shit out of it. So every day they would have to essentially rebuild this airstrip.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. These people were right in the line of fire every time as they were building and doing construction. And in the musical movie that we just watched, you see one black CB within, like, the battalion of CBs. That wouldn't have been the case because obviously the military was highly segregated still at this point. But in April 1942, the Navy announced that it would also enlist African Americans in the CBs, but there were only 2 colored units, quote unquote, and they were led, of course, by very white officers who apparently were very often from the South of America. So good luck. I don't think they would have had a very good time in those units, but I did find a photo of them on Bellaloo, so there they were there.
Yeah, they talk pretty extensively about these guys in the book as well. If the Americans wanted to take a particular island away from the Japanese, they would have to scout a nearby island from which they could build an airstrip so that not only could they send bombers from that airstrip, but they would also need a place for bombers and fighter planes that had become damaged to land. And of course, it would have been a crucial component of the supply line. And so what would happen is they'd be like, okay, we're going to land on this island, and in 14 days, we're going to have a working airstrip. On day 15, there are bombers scheduled to land here, whether this airstrip is done or not. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the amount of work it would take to land on an island where there's nothing, there's never been anything man-made, you need to build a 6,000-foot airstrip. There was one that they're talking about in the book where they go back and they ask the Air Force, this island is kind of small, the geography is a little bit funky, would it be okay if we built a 5,000-foot airstrip? And they were like, we could use a 5,000-foot airstrip, it would be okay, but just know that statistically, we think that 15 pilots will die if the airstrip is not 6,000 feet long. So that 1,000 feet is going to cost 15 lives. You just factor that into your plans, whichever way you go. And so they land on one of these islands. And basically what they would do in the Pacific in particular is a lot of these islands were just coral. And so there'd be hills on the islands that were covered in trees and brush and vegetation, but underneath was coral. And they would take the coral and that would be the kind of base for the runway. And they discovered later in the war that living coral was actually better. If they scooped it out of the ocean, they would flatten it into this runway. And then if you kept watering it with salt water, the coral would live for a little while longer. And then it would grow a little bit and it would fill in the cracks. And you would get a nice, solid, springy, spongy kind of runway.
So interesting. These are the kind of battalions you don't really think about that often. And for that alone, I'm glad I watched this movie, because otherwise I would not have known about the CDs. And you bet they would have been on Peleliu Airfield after the Americans had taken it too. It gives me kind of chill to think about that these people were just building and rebuilding while being shelled by the Japanese.
Yeah, for sure. A really dangerous job and a really crucial job, and unsung in some ways.
Thanks to this movie, we're both showing them and singing about them.
Definitely singing about them, yeah. We should rate this movie. What were we rating it out of?
We're rating it out of self-aware songs about racism out of 10.
Ah, yes.
You want to go first?
Sure. I'm going to rate this movie 6.5 self-aware songs about racism out of 10. I like when there are female characters that aren't hat racks, and I thought the female lead in this particular, Mitzi Gaynor, was really fun and bubbly and did a good job of portraying this character that we're supposed to like, and we're supposed to sort of identify with her. At the same time, she has these kind of like racist prejudices, but she's able to grow past them and learn. Didn't love the filters, and I don't know that it's my favorite musical that I've ever seen. And not, I would say, an amazing adaptation of the book if you care about that kind of thing, which sometimes it doesn't have to be. Like, this is obviously putting it in a totally different genre from where it came from, which is fine. Like, the adaptation's a little different. But yeah, I would say, 6.5. That sounds good to me.
All right. I will give this movie 5 self-aware songs about racism out of 10. I didn't enjoy it massively. I did enjoy Mitzi Gaynor's haircut, her short bob. It was amazing. And I did like the fact that this musical tries to be self-aware about racism. And it's not a bad time, but it's also not a very good time for me. I don't know. It gets a 5. It's mediocre, but not quite a 6.
We do appreciate the people who recommended it to us. It was a departure from what we usually cover.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd have never known there was a musical about World War II if you'd not recommended it to us. And also, I got to learn about the CBs, and I find the CBs absolutely fascinating, so thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, are you reading anything?
I am reading a book called Catch the Rabbit by, it's a foreign name, so I'm probably going to butcher it, but she's called Lana Bastatic, and I think she's Bosnian, so that's why I'm probably butchering the name. But I didn't really like it to begin with, and now I'm about probably 2/3 of the way, maybe slightly further in, and I like it better. So I think I'll finish it this week and think it's all right. And I'm also reading Agent So by Claire Miller, about a SOE agent from Poland.
Hell yeah. We're going to talk about more lady spies, is what you're telling me.
Yes, lady spies are the best. How about you?
I am reading Le Grand Cirque, Mémoires d'un pilote de chasse FFL dans la RAF by Pierre Klosterman. And it's a memoir that's quite well known in France about a fighter pilot who flew something like 400 missions during World War II. And it's based on the letters that he wrote home to his parents. So yeah, I'm a couple chapters into that and enjoying it so far. I haven't read anything in French in a while, so I'm definitely learning some military vocabulary. Like, I didn't know what a machine gun was in French, so I had to look that up. But you did, because the words are basically the same in Dutch.
Yes, mitrailleur.
Yeah, and you can use it as a verb in French too, mitrailler, to machine gun something.
I just want to say I'm really upset because there's a movie, which is why you're reading the book, so we can talk about the book and the movie. And it's in French, obviously, but there's not a version to be found on the internet that has any kind of subtitles or captions or anything. I'm going to use my best high school French to try and watch this movie, you guys.
I'm going to write some notes so that if at any point you get lost, you can go and be like, oh, yeah, that's what's happening.
I'm guessing I'll get maybe 1 or 2 words or 3 words out of every sentence. So if I'm lucky, if they're the right words, then I can try to figure it out.
Yeah. I mean, you know what the movie's about, so I feel like it can't be that hard to follow.
Do I know what the movie's about?
Yeah, it's a memoir about a fighter pilot. Like,
Fair. Yeah. How difficult can it be? I can see you thinking it's a flyboy.
yeah, I don't think it's going to be a really deep cerebral movie with paragraphs of dialogue.
Fair. That's fair. Yeah, so wish me luck, everybody, as I watch this tomorrow because I just rented it and I clicked play, which was really stupid because now I have 36 hours to watch it.
Well, bon chance, mon ami. I'm going to watch it tonight and write those notes.
Merci beaucoup. So thanks, everybody, for listening to another episode of Rosie the Reviewer. You can send this episode to a friend and you can listen wherever you get your podcast. I would also recommend you subscribe to our YouTube channel because we have one, and you can follow us on Instagram if you'd like, at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. And I don't know if I said this yet, but you can rate us 5 stars, and we would really appreciate it.
We love when you rate us 5 stars. Every time you rate us 5 stars, Musical gets its self-aware song about racism.
Excellent.